Here is the sewing tutorial for this mini flare dress with a balconette neckline. The sewing pattern is available on my Etsy shop if you guys want to purchase it and follow along. I originally designed this dress for an upcycle. It's on my TikTok if you guys want to see the behind the scenes, but today we're going to be recreating this look. To print, you guys have the option to go to the layers panel on the left-hand side and check only the size that you need. This just makes cutting it out a lot easier. Remember to leave the piece info on as well. To print, leave the orientation on at auto, print at actual size or 100% scale, and for the specific pages, refer to the instructions pamphlet. Lay out the pattern in alphabetic and numeric order. It's not totally necessary to trim along all of the outer edges. Just do what's necessary and align and tape those pieces together. Here is everything all cut out along with all of the trim that I'll be using. We have the invisible zipper, the hook and eye bra closure, underwire casing, trim to go along the bra cups, ring and slider, and a hook and eye to finish the zipper. I'll also be dyeing the trim that needs to be color matched. We'll start off by assembling the front bodice first. Take pieces 7 and 8, the front side and the side godet, and attach right sides together. We'll sew the first section of piece 10 to piece 11, the center front godet. Once that's finished, we're going to take pieces 7 and 8 and press the seam allowances towards the center. It's important to press as we go because we do have godets and all of the pieces are interconnected, so we press before moving on. Now for pieces 10 and 11, we're going to press the seam allowance towards the side, so away from the center. And this just helps with the bulkiness at the top corner. We will then attach the second set of piece 10 to the opposite side of piece 11. Remember to finish your seam allowances as you go. For this pattern, I have a 1/4 inch seam allowance included in the pattern. So you can see that I'm barely trimming any off. We're going to press the seam allowance as we did before, so away from the center towards the sides. Next, we're going to attach piece 9. So with right sides together, we're going to align it to the piece that we just finished. And then press this seam allowance downwards. We'll attach the sides to this front portion, right sides together, and you can press the seam allowances towards the center. Moving on to the back bodice, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to attach piece 13, the back godet, to the side piece 12, right sides together, and we're going to press the seam allowances towards the center, similar to what we did for the front bodice. Once that's finished, we'll attach piece 14, right sides together, and we'll press these seam allowances towards the center. Attach the front and back bodice together at the side seams. We can now attach this whole piece together at the center back seam. Make sure to leave space for the invisible zipper and sew only from the notch downward, and then press these seams open. Moving along to the straps, we're going to start off with the adjustable strap first. So with piece 19, I'm going to turn and press 1/4 inch along each side, fold it in half, and then press again so that no raw edges are showing, and then do a edge stitch on top. Another way you could do this is just to sew right sides together. Trim any excess seam allowance off and then turn right sides out. I just prefer to do it this way. Once you have that finished, we're going to cut each strap into 2 sections so that in total you'll have 4 pieces. The shorter piece is meant for the O-ring, and you can check the instructions booklet to find the specific measurements based on your size, and then just trim off any excess. Now with the main strap, piece number 5, we're going to sew right sides together, leaving the ends open. Once that's done, center the seam and press the seam allowances open. Before turning the strap right sides out, we're going to attach it to the adjustable strap. So with piece 19, the longer piece, we're going to insert it through the wide end and then line it up to the smaller back end to stitch down. Trim off any excess seam allowance, and to turn right sides out, we're just going to hold on to the skinnier adjustable strap while sliding the wider strap over to the other side. Center the strap seam and give it a good press. So because this is cut on the bias, depending on the fabric you used, it may have stretched out longer than we want. So line it up to the pattern piece and trim off any extra length. The fabric that I used did stretch out, but instead of trimming the excess off of the main strap, I decided to just keep the length and then trim off the excess on the adjustable strap so that the measurement will still be accurate. Now we're going to add a slight gather at the front end of the main strap. Machine base 1/4 inch from the raw edge, leaving a few inches of thread at the ends. Pull the threads and gather the fabric so that it measures out to be a little bit more than 1 inch, and knot it in place. Put the straps off to the side, and we're going to move on to the bra cups. Here I have all of my bra cup pieces laid out. I'm using the same fabric for my lining. We're going to start with the lower inner and outer cups. So right sides together, align the notches and stitch down. Once you're done, press open the seams. And then line up the notches of the upper cup, right sides together, and stitch down. For the lining, trim about 1/8 inch along the top. This just helps so that the lining doesn't show on the finished garment, so that the seam kind of pulls inward a little bit more. You'll still be sewing at 1/4 inch seam allowance though. Now for the foam pieces, we're going to trim 3/8 inch around all of the edges. This just helps to reduce the bulk once we add in the padding. We're going to start again by attaching the lower inner and outer cups like we did before, except this time we're going to leave both pieces right side up and line them up side by side without any overlap, and we're going to attach it together with a zigzag stitch. We're going to want to do a narrow zigzag stitch, so on my machine I set the length at 1.5 and the width at 4. Center the seam with the presser foot so that the zigzag stitch will catch both pieces as you sew. Instead of doing a back stitch, just knot off the ends and then use the same technique to attach the upper cup of the foam. Now that the cups are done, we're going to assemble everything together along with the strap. If you're adding trim along the bra cups, you can add it in now. If not, don't worry about it. So we're going to take the strap and line it up with the bra cup, right sides together, and then take the lining and lay it directly on top, right sides together, so that the strap is sandwiched in between. We're going to sew it all together along the upper edge. Once that's done, press the seam allowances towards the lining and do an understitch. So the understitch is only going to go through the lining and the seam allowance, not onto the main fabric. And this just helps to keep the lining in place and to help keep the lining from rolling forward onto the right side of the garment. I wanted my trim a little bit below the top edge, so I'm actually just going to sew it in now. We're now going to insert the foam padding, so it's going to go in between the main fabric and the lining. We're going to do a machine baste around the lower edge just to hold everything in place. Moving on to the back bands, as you can see, I applied a fusing to the outer fabric. This just helps to stabilize the fabric and hold its shape. So we're going to start by taking the short ends of the adjustable strap that we made earlier, piece 19, fold them in half and then iron them in place. Then we're going to slide the O-ring in through one end so that it kind of sits at the fold. Line them up with the notches on the back band and then line up the lining right sides together so that the O-ring is sandwiched in between. Then stitch along the top edge. Now for the front frame, piece number 1, we're going to line them up right sides together and sew along the top edges, so the underarm and the center front. Since the fabric I'm using is fairly thin, I decided to add in a fusing as well. It's not always necessary, so it just depends on what fabric you're using. Open up the back bands and the front frame, press the seam allowance towards the lining side, and then line up the pieces at the side seam. So instead of stitching fully down the seam, we're going to leave a 1/4 inch at the top and bottom open where the seam allowance is, and make sure to backstitch to secure. Trim off any excess seam allowance and then do an understitch along the back band lining and the underarm of the front frame. Press everything so that it's all nice and flat and lines up evenly. We'll then add a machine baste around the bra cups of the front frame to keep it in place. Now to finish off the bottom edge of the back band, we're going to turn and press inward the 1/4 inch seam allowance of both the lining and the outer fabric, and then do an edge stitch directly on top. So this is why it was important to keep that 1/4 inch seam allowance open at the side seam. Next, we'll move on to attaching the bra cups onto the front frame. So we'll start with right sides together at the center bridge, lining up the seams and just working your way around, matching the notches with the lower cup seam. You can pin this in place, or if you're a beginner, I'd recommend doing a hand baste instead before moving on to the machine stitch. Now with the underwire casing plush side face up, we're going to line it up with the seam allowance around the bra cup as close as we can to the original seam. Leave about 1/4 inch at the casing ends so that we can later turn it in for a clean finish. Sew it in place with an edge stitch, and again, try to get it as close as you can to the seam. We're only going to be stitching through the casing and the seam allowance at this step, so make sure not to go through the front frame just yet. So you can see that the casing is only attached to the seam allowance right now. We're going to take our scissors and trim off any excess seam allowance that we can to reduce the bulk. Iron it down, and we're going to use an edge stitch again to sew it in place. It's going to be about 3/8 inch away from the seam that we just sewed. It's important to keep this distance in between so that there's space for the underwire. If you're using an underwire, you can insert it now. Make sure to put it in directly into the casing and not just in between the casing and the seam allowance. I'm choosing to skip the underwire, so I'm just going to go straight into turning the ends of the casing in for a clean finish. If you have an industrial sewing machine, you can just do an edge stitch, but it's a little bit more difficult on a home sewing machine, so I just prefer to stitch it in place by hand. Now with the bra frame done, we can attach it to the front bodice. So right sides together, line it up with the side seams, and then stitch it down. Moving on to the front lining, I'm attaching pieces 15 to piece 16. And for the back lining, attaching piece 17 to piece 18. Then attaching both the front lining and back lining together at the side seams. And finally, attach the whole piece together at the center back seam, making sure to leave space for the invisible zipper and only sewing from the notch down, and press the seams open. With the completed lining, we're now going to attach it to the outer shell. So right sides together, line it up with the upper seam, and the bra frame will be sandwiched in between. Press the seam allowance downwards and towards the lining and then do an understitch around. Remember, the understitch is only going to be visible from the inside. So moving on to the invisible zipper, lay the dress face down so the back is facing you, and separate the lining so that it's away from the outer shell. Prep the zipper by ironing it out and gently push the coils outward so that it's easier to sew. Now with the zipper open, lay it face down on the left side and line it up to the seam allowance. I like to hand baste mine in place just for more accuracy. Next, we're going to flip the left side of the zipper over to the right side of the garment, and then flip it one more time so that the zipper is face down onto the garment. When we flip it the second time, it's important that we turn towards the right so that it functions properly. I'm hand basting the other side as well, and then just turning it right sides out just to double check to make sure that it works properly. Now we're going to attach it with the invisible zipper foot. So I actually misplaced mine somewhere, so I'm just going to use a regular zipper foot, but if you have an invisible zipper foot, make sure to use that one instead. Stitch as close as you can to the coils and as far down as you can before hitting the zipper pull. Repeat this for the other side, and once you're finished, trim off the excess zipper tape at the top. Next, we need to attach it to the lining, so turn the dress inside out so that the back lining is facing you. Starting on the left side, we're going to need to line up the seam allowance to the zipper. So we're going to take the lining on the left and then flip it over to the right so that the wrong side of the lining is now showing. So now you have a better view of the raw edges that you can now line up to the zipper. Keep in mind that the lining will be directly on top of the zipper, so it won't be visible. And as you're sewing, you just need to carefully feel along where the coil is and make sure that you aren't stitching through it. Repeat these steps for the other side. So for the right side lining, flip it over to the left so that the wrong side is now facing you. Line up the seam allowance to the zipper and then stitch down. Now we're going to close off that gap near the end of the zipper. Move the zipper end off to the side, and with right sides together, line up the seam allowance of where the gap is for the outer shell, stitch it down, and then do the same for the lining. We're done with the zipper. Now give it a good press, make sure it's working properly, and then just hand stitch a hook and eye directly above it. Now for the hook and eye bra closure. So for the hook portion, we're going to fold it in half so that the hooks are now along the outer edge. Press it in place and then line it up to the raw edge of the right back band so that the raw edge is now enclosed at the fold line and the hooks are face down. Now for the other side, the eye portion, we're going to line it up to the raw edge of the left band so that the raw edge is enclosed and the eyes are face up. Use an edge stitch to sew it in place. Make sure that the hooks are face up as you sew so they don't get caught in your sewing machine. I then go back and finish the edges of both the hook and eye with a narrow zigzag stitch to just reinforce. For my machine, I use a 0.8 length and a 5 width. Now we're going to finish off the ring and slider. So with the slider, insert the adjustable strap under one opening, over the center, and then out the other opening. Loop the strap over and through the O-ring that's already attached onto the back band. Then we're going to take the strap and insert it through the slider again, so under one end, over the center, and out the other end. To make this easier, loosen up the strap that's already through the slider just to create some ease and less tension and more space for the strap to go through once again. Now with the end of the strap, fold it downwards about 1/2 inch and stitch it in place. I like to do a hand baste before taking it to the machine just so it doesn't move as much. Trim off any excess fabric and you can burn the edges if you need or add some fray check. Lastly, we're going to do a baby hem to finish the outer shell and the lining. So we're going to start with a 3/8 inch straight stitch around the hemline, single layer. Once you're finished, press the raw edges towards the wrong side of the stitch line that we just sewed. And do an edge stitch along the fold line so that you're going through 2 layers of fabric. Once you're finished, trim off any excess seam allowance around the hemline, and then slightly roll the folded edge towards the wrong side again to create a small fold. Iron it in place and sew it down with an edge stitch. And that's it, we're finally finished. If you sewed along with me, congratulations! I would love to see your dress. If you have any helpful tips that you want to share with me and the community, drop it in the comments, and I'll see you for the next tutorial.